Is America doomed? According to historians William Strauss and Neil Howe, yes, America is going to have a major crisis on the likes of the Great Depression, World War II, in the next 20 years. But they did say that 25 years ago. Still, it's worth paying attention to what these guys have to say because, first of all, it's really interesting. And second of all, it would have predicted the Great Depression, World War II. It would have predicted the Civil War. It would have predicted the American Revolution. It's also possible that their prediction wasn't wrong. It was just early, right? Like, if you live in America, like you probably noticed in the past 10 years, it's gotten very different. You know, Trump got elected. There were riots in the streets in 2020. There was an attack on the Capitol in 2021. So it kind of seems like something's bubbling up and something bad is about to happen. So if America's doomed, why is it doomed? Well, Strauss and Howe say that America goes through 80 to 100-year cycles called saecula, and at the end of every saeculum, there's a crisis. That probably sounds ridiculous, but if you look back at history, there is a crisis every 80 to 100 years. So why would there be a crisis every 80 to 100 years like clockwork? Well, because that's the length of a human life. Strauss and Howe say that the historical events that happen when you're a kid influence the way you see the world for the rest of your life, right? If World War II is going on when you're a kid, then they'll influence you forever. If you see JFK get shot when you're 10 years old, that'll influence you forever. That means everyone who's growing up at around the same time is going to have a similar psyche that's different from their parents and different from their kids. And when that generation gets into power, they're going to run the world in a way that corresponds to that psyche. So for example, the GI generation, the generation that grew up during the Depression and then fought during World War II. When they got into power, they wanted everything to be nice and standardized and predictable so that it would work, right? They cared more about things working well than things being spiritual and neat and pretty. Then the baby boomers grew up in that world where everything was standardized and predictable and where people cared more about how well things worked than about how spiritual and pretty they were. And they rebelled against that, right? They wanted to rediscover their spiritual side. They wanted to fight back against the morality of their parents. In other words, generations impact history, and then history impacts generations. Strauss and Howe say that there are 4 archetypes of generations. There's the hero, the artist, the prophet, and the nomad. Whenever there's a big crisis, the heroes are around 20 to 40 years old. So they're the ones that go and deal with the crisis, right? They fight in the war, they make order out of chaos. Meanwhile, the artists are still growing up, and so they're being protected by their parents, they're uncertain about their future, and they're worried about what's going to happen to them. Once the crisis is over, the heroes come home, and they have a bunch of babies, and they coddle those babies, right? They raise them in the most immaculate and pristine environment possible because they don't want their kids to face the hardships that they faced. This leads to a generation that is perfectly healthy, but they're missing on the spiritual side of things, and they rebel against their parents. When the prophet generation comes of age, there's what Strauss and Howe call an awakening, which is a period in history where cultural norms are rethought, the young people rebel against the system, and they try to improve it. Meanwhile, the kids who come of age during an awakening are mostly neglected by their parents, who are too busy dealing with all the changes in the outside world to pay much attention to them. That makes them very cynical, and it makes them think, we got to deal with all our problems ourselves. When they come of age, the world becomes what Strauss and Howe call an unraveling, which is a world that works really well, but it's apathetic and nihilistic, and people aren't as happy as they ought to be. Eventually there's a crisis, and everyone comes together to deal with the crisis, starting the whole cycle all over again. If you look at the past 500 years of Britain and the United States' history, you see this pattern repeat itself 6 times. So if all this is true, then why hasn't there been a crisis yet? Well, one possibility is that there have been a couple false crises where everyone said, like, oh, the sky is falling, it's the next crisis, but it didn't end up being that big of a deal historically, right? So 9/11 happened, for example, and everyone freaked out about it, everyone panicked, we started 2 wars in the Middle East, we made all these new rules about what you're allowed to take on airplanes, but it didn't end up being that big of a historical event. Same thing with COVID. So for about 1.5 years, we were totally freaking out over this virus. We were saying like, oh, we gotta stay indoors, we gotta wear masks, we gotta social distance. But it didn't turn out to be a deadly enough virus to really cause the historical crisis that we thought the pandemic was. And that's not to say that COVID and 9/11 weren't important, but they weren't as important as like the Great Depression or World War II or the Civil War or the American Revolution or stuff on that scale. Strauss and Howe say that there's 2 components to any historical event, right? There's the thing that happens, and then there's the way that people react to it. And the thing that happens is totally random, it can happen anytime, but the way that people react to it is influenced by the season of history that they're in. So for example, if World War II had happened at a different time in American history, we might have just ignored it. Maybe you can't have a crisis era without some sort of spark and without that spark, you just get a really, really long unraveling period. Another possibility is that the baby boomers broke this cycle because they are ashamed of the way that they acted in the 60s, and reflecting back on it, do not want their kids to be like that. Most generations raise their kids to be like them and end up with kids that are not like them, whereas maybe the baby boomers raised their kids to not be like them and ended up with kids who are like them. Strauss and Howe predicted that millennials would become a hero generation, but in a lot of ways they're more similar to a prophet generation, right? They care a lot about values and doing what's right. And then finally, it's possible that Strauss and Howe's theory is total bullshit, and it doesn't actually hold true in the real world. So will there be a crisis in America? Maybe, maybe not. It's hard to say. Obviously, there are a lot of really smart people like Ray Dalio and Peter Turchin who have made computer models that say there's a high probability that there will be a crisis in America soon. Also, things in America are really, really tense right now, and it kind of feels like something is bubbling below the surface, and eventually it'll explode. On the other hand, history is really, 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 really complicated, and it's hard to predict in advance. And you can't just say, oh, well, the seasons are aligned and the stars are aligned, and so there will definitely be a crisis. It's always more complicated than that. All we can really do is hope for the best and plan for the worst. So that's it for today's Theo's Book Club. I hope you enjoyed. If you're new here, my name's Theo. I make brief videos like this one, going over the big ideas in the books that I read, so that you can learn what I learned and so that you can decide whether or not you want to read these books yourself. If you like this video, I hope you'll hit the thumbs up button down there. That tells YouTube this is a good video and that they should show it to more people. Also, you can hit the subscribe button if you want to see more of these book breakdowns, if you want to see more of my smiling face popping up in your feed. And until then, I hope you have a great day, and let's see what happens.